Nobody knows the identity of the first Jew to set foot in what is now Canada. Or at the very least, we don't have anything conclusive. But it was probably a fur trader working for the Hudson's Bay Company in the Arctic sometime in the late 17th or early 18th century. In 1697, Dutch Jewish merchant Joseph de la Peña was granted a royal charter to colonize Labrador for England, but no colonization took place, and in any case he never set foot there. Instead, the first Jewish name that appeared in this land was that of Esther Brandeau, a woman of about 20 from Bayonne in southwestern France. Orphaned in a shipwreck at 15, Brandeau had spent the intervening years disguised as a boy, taking on odd jobs around the country before joining the crew of a ship bound for New France. Brandeau wasn't a devout Jew. After losing her parents, she was taken in by Gentiles who gave her a taste for non-kosher food, and she vowed never to return to her old life. But the 1685 Code Noir banned Jews from living in France's North American colonies, and that kind of nuance wouldn't protect her. At some point, her true identity was revealed, she was taken into custody, and after refusing to convert to Catholicism, she was sentenced to deportation. Unfortunately, New France was a barter economy, and the court didn't have enough cash on hand to pay for her return voyage, allowing her to remain in Quebec for a full year until King Louis XV agreed to foot the bill himself. Brandeau only lived in what is now Canada for a brief segment of her life, but in recent decades she's been sentimentalized as a totem of Jewish representation in early Canadian history. This gets to one of the major differences between Canadian and American historiography. Because a disproportionate number of Canadians have made their historical mark in Britain or the US, a tradition has emerged by which any person, technology, or cultural artifact linked to Canada gets claimed as Canadian. But that's not the approach I'll be taking. Despite what 30 Rock will tell you, Canada has one of the largest Jewish populations in the world, which means we get to pick and choose. And I'm going to focus on figures that have played an active role in Canadian society rather than just being born there, leaving, and never looking back. Why not a Canadian pickle, Seth Rogen? For shame. By Brandeau's time, Nova Scotia was firmly in British hands, and in 1748, London's Bevis Marks Synagogue made tentative plans to resettle the city's poorest Jews there. The plan was never carried out, though a small number of Jews settled in Nova Scotia as fishermen, traders, and military supply contractors. Then, in 1759, during the globe-spanning 7 Years' War, a British force under Brigadier Geoffrey Amherst captured Quebec City before advancing on Montreal the following year. Despite marching under the British flag, about a third of Amherst's men were colonial militia from New York and Pennsylvania, including several dozen Jewish soldiers, officers, and suppliers. With the war in America effectively over, about 25 Jews decided to stay in the city permanently. Because they were almost all men, this community struggled to survive in its early years. While some enticed Jewish women from New York, Philadelphia, and London to join them, others renounced Judaism to marry French and indigenous women, and even more simply left. But for each person who left, more arrived, and the community grew quickly enough to establish the Synagogue of She'erit Yisrael, better known as the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue. In 1775, the colonies to the south rebelled against British rule in what came to be known as the American Revolution. Given Montreal Jews' close ties to the 13 colonies, their reaction wasn't what you'd expect. South of the border, Jewish communities overwhelmingly supported the rebel cause, probably more than any other religious group. And when the United States formally declared independence in 1776, one of the listed grievances was the Quebec Act, which confirmed the supremacy of French civil law and the Catholic Church in the colony. Canadian Jews had opposed this law as well, due to its implications for their religious freedom, and the English-speaking middle class that they were part of shared the Americans' desire for home rule. But Canadian Jews' status as English speakers in a mostly Catholic and French-speaking country also reinforced their sense of Britishness. When the Americans invaded in 1775, only 2 local Jews chose to take their side. The creation of a hard border between Canada and the US only deepened this feeling, especially for the emerging generation of Jews born in Canada. Though they still maintained close ties to their cousins in the South, the two communities were on diverging paths. In the US, political anti-Semitism was the exception. In Canada, it was the rule. In 1791, the British reorganized Quebec, creating the new colony of Upper Canada for Americans who had fled the Revolution, establishing limited self-government for both regions, and elevating the churches of England and Scotland to equal status with Catholicism. Though this was a step toward liberal democracy, it came nowhere close to the US Constitution, which eliminated religious requirements for federal office and created a strict separation between church and state. In majority French Lower Canada, public education was run directly by the Catholic and Protestant churches. The Jewish community was too small to justify their own school system and thus sent their children to Protestant schools. And Canadian officials were still required to swear an oath on the true faith of a Christian in the British style. Something had to give. In 1807, Ezekiel Hart won a by-election to represent his hometown of Trois-Rivières in the Lower Canadian Legislative Assembly. Hart was a scion of Trois-Rivières' only Jewish family, and rather than take the oath of office as prescribed by law, he swore on the true faith of a Jew with his hand on a Hebrew Bible. It was an instant constitutional crisis. Majority Leader Pierre Stanislas Bédard published numerous letters in his newspaper Le Canadien arguing that Jews were incapable of citizenship, and suggested that either Hart had stolen the election or the people of Trois-Rivières had broken the law by voting for him. Within days, the Assembly voted to ban Hart, and all Jews, from holding office without swearing the oath on the true faith of a Christian. So that's what Hart did, winning election again in 1808 and swearing the oath as instructed. This, of course, was perjury, and he was again barred from office. He didn't run again, but his cause was supported by Assemblyman John Richardson, the English-speaking Quebec Mercury newspaper, and an up-and-coming politician in Bédard's party named Louis-Joseph Papineau. Outside the assemblies, Jewish emancipation was becoming a de facto reality. Jews had already served in the provincial militia for decades and soon found themselves defending Canada and invading the US in the War of 1812. One of those men was veteran fur trader David, who defended Montreal against American invasion. After the war, David became director of the Bank of Montreal and was a key partner in the construction of the Lachine Canal, which probably would have turned Montreal into the most important city on the continent if not for the opening of New York's Erie Canal just a year later. By this time, Papineau had risen to become leader of the Lower Canadian Assembly, and in 1832 he championed the Hart Act, abolishing religious oaths for public office. Upper Canada followed suit 8 months later. Equivalent laws failed to pass in Britain until 1858. Papineau had transformed his party into an explicit independence movement, and in 1837 he found himself leading an armed rebellion against British rule in favor of an American-style republic. He wasn't really in control of the situation. At one point, the English-speaking hunting clubs that rebelled in Upper Canada plotted the mass strangling of Upper Canada's 50 or so Jews. But before that could happen, both rebellions were crushed. The Canadas were reunified, and Papineau spent several years in exile, though he eventually received amnesty and returned to politics. As in the United States, Canada hadn't had any rabbis. For the Americans, this wasn't a huge problem. The Jewish population was much bigger, they became accustomed to the absence of religious authority, and Jewish religious thought there was generally very pluralistic. But until 1846, She'erit Yisrael was Canada's only synagogue, and the lack of qualified religious leaders was beginning to undermine the community's credibility with Orthodox Jews in Britain. Luckily, they recruited one of the foremost rabbis in the Western world. The son and grandson of former chief rabbis of London, Abraham de Sola was only 21 when he arrived in Canada, but he was the quintessential British gentleman scholar, working concurrently as rabbi of She'erit Yisrael and a professor of Hebrew at McGill University, where he was immensely popular. Like his congregation, de Sola maintained close relations to Jews in the US and became very well known there, to the point that US President Ulysses S. Grant invited him to perform Congress's opening prayer in 1872, the first Jew or British subject to do so. De Sola was an outspoken opponent of Reform Judaism, which at the time was a much more radical and assimilationist movement than it is today, though he never had to worry about it in Canada. Though the first American reformists were native-born, the movement mainly proliferated due to a mass influx of Jewish immigrants from Central and Western Europe, especially Germany, where Reform originated. That wave of immigration wasn't entirely absent from Canada. Back in the 1830s, Samuel Liebschitz founded Jewsburg near the German settlement of Berlin, today's Kitchener. And in 1849, German Jewish immigrants established Toronto's first synagogue. But in the US, those newcomers were arriving in the tens of thousands, with many rising to prominence in the California Gold Rush and the Civil War. In Canada, they were far fewer and far poorer. Even most Jewish immigrants were still coming from Britain. as by the 1860s it had become common practice for London synagogues and Jewish aid organizations to deal with their city's Jewish underclass by exporting them to the colonies. So unlike in the US, the upper echelons of Canadian Jewry remained Sephardic, Orthodox, and proudly British. Over this same period, Jews began to appear in national politics for the first time since the Hart Affair. In 1856, conservative journalist George Benjamin became the first Jew to sit in the Parliament of a united Canada, only to have that distinction stripped away shortly after his death when the country's political system was once again reorganized. In 1867, the British North America Act united Upper and Lower Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia into a single Canadian Confederation, with a much more autonomous government. Over the next several years, the new state steadily incorporated most of British North America, and when British Columbia joined in 1871, it was Henry Nathan Jr. of Victoria, rather than Benjamin, who was immortalized as Canada's first Jewish MP. Born in London, Nathan was one of many Jews from the Anglosphere who settled on Canada's west coast during a brief gold rush. Though a member of the Liberal Party, Nathan alienated his colleagues by giving support to the Conservative government of Sir John A. Macdonald. He didn't contest the 1874 election and returned to Britain just 2 years later. Confederation is sometimes characterized as the beginning of Canada's journey towards independent nationhood, but figures like Nathan prove otherwise. Relations between Britain and the US in the mid-19th century were extremely bad. Not the worst they'd ever been, but bad enough that when Britain saw the US emerge from a brutal civil war somehow stronger than before, their response was to create a buffer state. The desire for reconciliation is why President Grant invited De Sola to perform Congress's opening prayer in 1872. If he'd merely wanted to mend fences with American Jews, he would have invited an American rabbi. A more foundational member of BC's Jewish community was David Oppenheimer. An immigrant from Bavaria, he'd made his name in real estate during the California Gold Rush before participating in British Columbia's gold rush in 1858. He soon got into politics, helping to rebuild the city of Vancouver after a devastating fire and eventually becoming mayor. He was also an early investor in the Canadian Pacific Railroad, which finally linked eastern and western Canada in 1885. The completion of a transcontinental railroad coincided with a major shift in the Jewish world. In 1881, Russian Emperor Alexander II was assassinated by members of a left-wing underground movement. When one of the conspirators was discovered to be Jewish, a series of pogroms broke out targeting Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement, which lasted 3 years. At the same time, Russian ministers issued a series of laws further restricting Jews' economic rights, as well as their ability to serve in the military. These weren't the first instances of anti-Semitic violence or laws in the Russian Empire by any means, but social and technological change enabled the news to reach the West much faster than before. The situation was met with unprecedented sympathy from the West, Jews and Gentiles alike, precipitating what would soon become the largest mass migration in Jewish history. In February 1882, some of London's foremost artists, politicians, and theologians gathered to protest against Russian tyranny at Mansion House. One attendee was Canadian High Commissioner Alexander Galt, who soon crafted a scheme to resettle Jewish refugees from the Russian Empire on farmsteads in the remote district of Assiniboia in the Northwest Territories. As in the US, the Canadian government under Macdonald had expropriated huge amounts of land from native tribes in the western prairies to give away to settlers for farming. But when the Long Depression hit in the 1870s, Macdonald responded with a series of tariffs that kept the economy stagnant for more than 20 years and discouraged would-be homesteaders. By using the land as a refuge for Jews, Galt hoped to solve both of their problems, but the result was disastrous. The arrivals were destitute, few in number, and totally unprepared for farming in the extreme climate of the prairies. By 1890, only a single farm remained. Though the Macdonald government's immigration policy was very open, its economic policies left Canada in such a desperate position that more people were leaving the country than moving in. Macdonald's death in 1891 finally broke the Conservatives' hold. In 1896, the Liberals swept into government under the leadership of Wilfrid Laurier, who sought to make up for lost time, restore the country's economic dynamism, and resume the project of Canadian independence, in no small part through the power of immigration.
America is a melting pot. Canada is a mosaic.
Given the current state of US-Canada relations, it's perhaps understandable. And I'm American, so a lot of you watching will automatically dismiss anything I have to say about Canadian political identity. But the concept of the melting pot versus the mosaic is a distinction without a difference, and it's unfortunate that a lot of Americans nowadays buy into it. The Melting Pot was originally a 1908 play by a British Jewish writer celebrating American multiculturalism, and one need only look at the experience of Jewish immigrants to Canada at the turn of the 20th century to see the similarities in action. Entering government in 1896, Laurier set out to establish a common market between Canada and the US, but faced prolonged opposition in both countries. So in the meantime, he lowered trade barriers with other countries, subsidized the construction of 2 more transcontinental railways, and redoubled efforts to settle the prairies. In 1891, the US stopped allowing homesteaders to claim public land, enabling the Laurier government to begin advertising Canadian farmland directly to European immigrants as the last best West. As an added bonus, Laurier's first term coincided with a massive gold rush in what soon became the Yukon Territory. By 1900, Canada was the fastest growing economy on Earth, creating the perfect conditions for sustained large-scale immigration. Between 1881 and 1900, 10,000 Jews immigrated to Canada. Over the next 20-year period, the number was over 70,000. This was only a small portion of the total number of immigrants, and a drop in the bucket compared to the nearly 2 million Jews arriving in the US at the time, but they still dwarfed the existing Jewish community. Coming mostly from the Russian Empire, Romania, and the Austrian Empire's Galicia region, they were a marked contrast to their predecessors. For a variety of reasons, Maskilic streams of Judaism like Reform, Conservative, and even Modern Orthodoxy never took root in Eastern Europe like they did in the West, so these people were much more religiously polarized, favoring either secularism or ultra-Orthodoxy. Living conditions varied widely from one place to the next. The worst could be found in Toronto. For virtually its entire existence, the neighborhood of St. John's Ward had been a slum, hosting multiple waves of immigrants and refugees. By the end of the Laurier government, nearly 12,000 immigrants, mostly Jewish, occupied a labyrinth of overcrowded, unsanitary tenements and backyard shanties, right in the shadow of City Hall. Comparisons to London's Whitechapel and New York's Lower East Side are inescapable, and only a damning public health report in 1911 made it impossible for local politicians to ignore. As the ward was cleared out, Jewish Torontonians relocated to Kensington Market, Harbour Village, Palmerston, and eventually outlying suburbs like York and Forest Hill. Compare that to the experience of Jewish immigrants in Winnipeg. Winnipeg. Winnipeg, Winnipeg, Winnipeg. The forks beneath the forks beneath the forks. The growth of the railroads had elevated Winnipeg to Canada's 3rd largest city with its 3rd largest Jewish population. Its Jewish working class was hardly better off than that of Toronto, but in a newer metropolis built to more modern standards, immigrants in the North End could enjoy all the typical comforts of a working-class streetcar suburb. There was even a second wave of Jewish agricultural colonies. While Galt unconvincingly deflected responsibility for his project, French Jewish aristocrat Maurice de Hirsch launched the Jewish Colonization Association with the intention of settling refugees on farms all over the world. The JCA's largest project was in Argentina, but over a 20-year period, they helped establish at least 17 Jewish farming communities on the prairies. Unlike Galt, Hirsch had money to burn and spared no expense training, equipping, and providing logistical support to the new farmers. Almost all the farms were abandoned during the Great Depression, though a handful of families were still working their farms as late as the 1980s. Ultimately, the most common destination was still Montreal. As English-speaking Jews decamped for newer neighborhoods to the west, immigrants took their place around the Boulevard Saint-Laurent, turning Yiddish into the city's 3rd language. Well, I'm going to Kmart, which is what I call Kensington Market.
Oh, that's where I live.
The largest source of employment for Jewish immigrants was textiles. Having been a mostly urban population in the Old World, they were disproportionately trained in specialized occupations, most commonly as tailors. Jews didn't pack themselves into the filth of St. John's Ward just because it was cheap, but because of its proximity to the factories that supplied Eaton's department store. Taking advantage of cheap sewing machines, some families even took subcontracts in order to work from home. As if the big factories weren't bad enough, an 1898 investigation of home workshops by journalist Mackenzie King revealed not only unsafe conditions, but the tendency to employ women in order to pay as little as possible, work them up to 90 hours a week, and even coerce small children into working without pay. The situation in Montreal was painfully ironic, as most of the retailers, factory owners, and contractors exploiting Jewish labor were themselves Jewish, and prided themselves on supporting civil rights and toleration for their fellow Jews while hiring off-duty cops to beat up striking Jewish workers. The good news is that this attracted a lot of attention from American Jewish garment workers, who helped establish Canadian chapters of the major trade unions. This in turn brought working-class immigrants into politics, and by the turn of the century, Canada had become unusually fertile ground for two of the era's biggest Jewish movements. Zionism faced far less opposition in Canada than in the US, where a wealthy, Germanized reformist establishment maintained a strong stance against separatism of any kind. That demographic was almost totally absent from Canada, and not only did the prevailing Anglo-Sephardic elite support a Jewish cultural center in Ottoman Palestine, they led the charge. The settlers of the failed community at Hauran in the 1880s were from Montreal. Zionism in Canada had opponents, but rather than an assimilationist establishment, they were other Jewish nationalists. The General Jewish Labor Bund advocated for Jewish autonomy within a socialist state, in the areas of language, culture, and education. Bundism wasn't absent from the US, but it proved more durable and influential in Canada, particularly in linguistically divided Montreal and in Winnipeg, where Jews made up a larger share of the population and where the exceptional power of trade unions and tensions with the Ukrainian community brought political participation to the forefront of Jewish life. By 1909, the Bundist-aligned Workmen's Circle had chapters in all three main cities, in some cases even starting Yiddish-language socialist schools. Every Canadian Jew faced some form of anti-Semitism, but it was mostly casual. Businesses refusing to hire or promote Jewish employees, restrictive covenants barring Jews from owning homes in certain neighborhoods, university quotas limiting the number of Jewish students, things that would be illegal today, but were taken for granted at the time, and certainly weren't limited to Jews. Political anti-Semitism took the form of occasional op-eds in Catholic newspapers like Montreal's True Witness and La Vérité, or occasional missives by priests trying to capitalize on events like the Dreyfus Affair in France or the Baylis Affair in Ukraine. For a few years, notary Jacques-Édouard Plamondon tried to create a full-time anti-Semitic movement in Quebec City, though his ideas failed to catch on beyond his hometown, and he spent most of his remaining years in a mental institution. But just because these efforts didn't go mainstream doesn't mean they didn't warrant a response. As far back as 1897, clothing magnate Lyon Cohen and civil rights lawyer Samuel William Jacobs founded the Canadian Jewish Times, later known as the Canadian Jewish Chronicle and Chronicle Review. We shouldn't kid ourselves. Cohen and Jacobs were rich, educated English speakers. As a major player in the textile industry, Cohen was a fervent opponent of labor unions and one of several Jewish factory owners who accused striking workers of provoking anti-Semitism by making Jews look bad. Accordingly, the Jewish Times' way of countering anti-Semites combined ideas of Canadianization with a general celebration of Jewish excellence, such as Captain Hyman Lightstone's service in the Second Boer War. But even if they disagreed on the labor issue, most immigrants agreed with the Jewish Times on most other things. Jacobs later became a King's Counsel and Member of Parliament, and in 1919, Cohen founded the Canadian Jewish Congress as a civil rights lobby that sought partnership with other minorities facing discrimination. The most serious anti-Semitism of the period came from a debate over Jewish access to public education in Quebec. Even after Confederation, provincial schools remained segregated between Catholics and Protestants, with most Jewish children attending Protestant schools in exchange for tax revenue from Jewish-owned property. As most new immigrants didn't own any property, Montreal's Protestant school board began denying entry to their kids, a decision supported by the provincial court. Quebec's parliament responded by mandating Jewish access to Protestant schools, but the school board continued to oppose the law, encouraging at least one teacher to bully and harass her mostly Jewish students. It wasn't well received, but it marked a decided cultural shift, and private Jewish schools proliferated in response. These weren't a united school system, and their curricula could vary wildly. But if anything, that only made them more popular, and they spread to other provinces where there was no equivalent question over public schooling. While all of this was going on, Canada underwent another change in government. Once the US finally took an interest in Laurier's proposal for a common market, the Conservatives accused him of selling the country out and won back control in 1911. All the stuff with the schools, the strikes, and the anti-Semitic newspapers was going on when this election happened, and it didn't actually change much. New Prime Minister Robert Borden was a moderate, and at times governed in coalition with independents and moderate liberals. The thing he's most known for is leading Canada through the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, nearly 5,000 Jews served in the Canadian Armed Forces, more than a third of all adult Jewish men in the country, and that's without counting the 300 or so Canadians who served in the Jewish Legion, a multinational force that served on the Palestine front. Like many other British colonies, Canada's government came out of the war feeling that it had earned its place as an equal nation. So Prime Minister Borden made a huge step towards independence by signing the Treaty of Versailles separately from the UK, giving itself a seat at the newly formed League of Nations. Over 66,000 Canadians died in the war, and nearly triple that number were seriously wounded, most of them disabled. That's to say nothing of those who came home with shell shock, what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder. While Lillian Fryman was forming the Canadian branch of Hadassah, she was already hard at work as a public health advocate, supplying the Canadian Red Cross during the war before aiding servicemen's transition back to civilian life through the Great War Veterans Association, today's Royal Canadian Legion. In 1921, she met with French humanitarian Anna Guerin, who first introduced poppy pins to the US in order to commemorate Armistice Day, and so Fryman began producing her own poppies for Canada. This is why you see almost every Canadian wearing one on the 11th of November to this day. And for her various efforts, Canada came to regard Fryman as a war hero in her own right. While the United States followed the war with an isolationist backlash and nearly a decade of ultra-conservative government, Canada's first post-war election resulted in a leftward shift, with a new government under Mackenzie King. Yes, the journalist who reported on the sweatshops. King's government didn't restrict immigration in the 1920s the way that the US did. So many Jewish immigrants and refugees who would have settled in the US ended up in Canada instead, particularly the extended family of Jews who'd arrived in America before the war. This is the final resting place of Molly Bronstein, who immigrated to Montreal from the Soviet Union in 1925 with her husband, father, and children. Molly had an older brother, Nathan Schenker, who'd been living in Cleveland for decades. He arrived as a teenager. And though the restrictive new laws in the US still prioritized visas for family reunification, those laws only applied to children, spouses, and parents. So while Molly's dad was allowed to continue to the US, she and her family ended up in Montreal. Mind you, the American laws only restricted immigration from the old world. Any able-bodied adult with a clean criminal record and at least 2 years residency in Canada had a free pass. But most immigrants like the Bronsteins were already establishing roots in their new homes. So that's why I have Canadian cousins. The Great War also hastened Canada's adoption of prohibition, banning the production and sale of alcohol except for medical or religious purposes. Unlike in the US, Canadian prohibition was only ever enacted on the provincial level, and its proliferation across the country had more to do with support for the war than anything else. Almost as soon as the war ended, support for prohibition collapsed. Quebec made alcohol legal again, most of the rest of the country started ignoring their prohibition laws, and social reformers began to see the problems that this was causing, so the provinces transitioned from banning the alcohol trade to simply regulating it. But just as this was happening, the US enacted prohibition nationwide, and since most Canadians lived very close to the US border, that was an opportunity. Almost from the beginning, prohibition was as unpopular in the US as it had been in Canada. Enforcement was minimal, and alcohol was as readily available as it had ever been. As most American Jews lived fairly close to the Canadian border, smuggling became an ample opportunity to create a stable income, and it's been estimated that 50% of bootleggers were Jewish. Since it wasn't illegal for them, Canadians were happy to profit off the liquor trade. Born on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic and raised on the prairies of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, Samuel Bronfman came from a family of wealthy tobacco farmers. When they discovered tobacco doesn't grow in Canada, he and his brothers took on odd jobs and began dabbling in hotels. While running a hotel in Winnipeg, Bronfman discovered that a huge amount of the revenue wasn't coming from the rooms but the bar, and decided to get into liquor distribution. as Canada repealed Prohibition while the US adopted it, Bronfman moved to Montreal, established the Distillers Corporation, bought out the Ontario-based Seagram Distillery, and turned it into one of the largest companies in the world. But the good times, if they could be called that, were about to end. The onset of the Great Depression brought a few interesting developments. Over the previous decade, trade unions and farmers' associations had fueled a surge of socialist parties known collectively as the Ginger Group. In the cities, garment unions brought a prominent Jewish presence to the Gingers, and in 1925 they elected one of their own to Parliament in British-born A.A. Heaps. In 1932, the Gingers formally unified into the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which even incorporated Bundist politicians like David Lewis, the son of a Bundist leader in Belarus who'd refused to join the communists in the Russian Civil War. Though Bundism wasn't a big highlight of the CCF platform, it played an important role in shaping the party's attitude toward multiculturalism, as well as its opposition to Soviet-style communism. If you were a socialist politician in Canada after 1932 and you weren't in the CCF, people were going to assume you were a Soviet stooge. In 1931, Ottawa ratified the Statute of Westminster, gaining almost full independence. The same year, unfortunately, the short-lived government of R.B. Bennett invoked emergency powers from the First World War to implement an immigration policy that was even more extreme than that of the U.S., banning all immigrants except for British subjects, U.S. citizens, and their immediate family. In 1935, Bennett's mishandling of Canada's economic recovery resulted in the return of Mackenzie King's Liberals. But the new government was more than happy to continue the policy, especially when it came to Jews. The timing couldn't have been worse. By this time, the Nazi Party had seized power in Germany, implementing a long list of anti-Jewish laws and convincing about half of all German and Austrian Jews to flee. As the Nazis' hold on Germany tightened, the number of refugees grew. So in July 1938, the US called a conference of 32 friendly nations in the French town of Evian to work out an international agreement for their resettlement. Almost all of these countries had serious reservations about accepting Jews in large numbers, either out of bigotry or a genuine fear that their arrival would inflame Nazi sympathies within their borders. But even hesitant governments like the US, UK, and Australia expressed a willingness to take a limited number of refugees, and in practice ended up taking more. Unfortunately, any comprehensive agreement was doomed by those countries refusing any refugees at all, among them Canada, whose representative had been instructed to subtly undermine the negotiations. This was mainly due to Chief Immigration Official Frederick Blair, who viewed Jews as a hostile race of hyper-competent overachievers. To him, Canadian Jews' pleas to admit refugees weren't cries for help, but evidence of a worldwide conspiracy to undermine the rule of law and take over the country. Even after the outbreak of the Second World War, he suggested that Jews needed to atone for their racial failings in order to rehabilitate themselves into a somehow whiter people. Blair's fanaticism found no argument with Prime Minister King. Though broadly liberal in domestic policy, he was deeply neurotic and just as deeply involved in the spiritualist movement, believing he could communicate telepathically with other world leaders, claiming to experience prophetic visions, and even seeking political advice by holding seances to summon the spirits of his mother and his dog. Unsurprisingly, he claimed to receive knowledge that both Canada and the Jewish people were special mystical entities whose power derived from their racial purity, and thus the two could never coexist. His government would be happy to facilitate the resettlement of Jewish refugees, but not in Canada. King's cosmic consciousness never impacted policy toward Canadian Jews, but the country had no shortage of far-right nationalists to do it for him. In 1930, Quebec's proposal for a Jewish school system met an overwhelming backlash from integralists in the Catholic Church and reactionary French separatists, bringing Quebec nationalism into the mainstream for the first time in over a century. At its forefront was Father Lionel Groulx, a Catholic priest and leading figure of the short-lived National Liberal Action Party. Though the ALN was economically progressive and Groulx disapproved of legal discrimination on the basis of race, he also opined that God had abandoned the Jews and elected French Canadians as his new chosen people, that the supreme authority of the Catholic Church was intrinsic to French Canadian culture, that any Jewish presence in the province was a threat to that culture, and that citizens must take it upon themselves to pressure them into leaving. This sentiment had consequences. In June 1934, doctors at Notre Dame Hospital in Montreal went on strike to protest the hiring of Jewish intern Sam Rabinovich. In what came to be known as the Days of Shame, hardline separatist writers and priests rallied to the defense of those who considered the very presence of a Jewish doctor offensive, if not satanic. Each day, more hospital staff walked off the job, leaving critically ill and injured patients to die. After 5 days, the issue was settled. Rabinovich resigned from his position, Notre Dame pledged to never hire a Jew to any position ever again, and the University of Montreal, from which Rabinovich had graduated, announced further restrictions on the number of Jewish students. Grue was a comparative moderate. Compare him to Adrien Arcon, a former trade unionist and once respected journalist who pivoted hard into far-right politics in the 1920s as editor of the satirical newspaper Le Goglu. In addition to republishing Nazi propaganda, Arcon used Le Goglu as a mouthpiece to claim that Jews were responsible for all crime, that all communists were Jewish, that the French Revolution had been an illegitimate Jewish conspiracy, and that pure-blooded French Canadians, as the last vestige of the Ancien Régime, were a master race with a special destiny to carry the cross and wield the sword against the rising tide of democracy. Though interestingly, he wasn't a Quebec separatist. In 1934, Arcon formed the Christian National Socialist Party, or Blue Shirts, which engaged in a campaign of terror against Jews all over the province. They mostly focused on smaller communities in places like Val-David, where Arcon's men attempted to burn down a synagogue with the congregation trapped inside. But Montreal Jews were hardly immune from blue shirt violence, especially at funerals or during Easter. Arcon's overt friendship with Nazi Germany locked him out of the mainstream, enabling more moderate anti-Semites to avoid responsibility for the views that they shared. But the PNSC was far from Canada's only pro-Nazi movement. It wasn't even the first. In 1933, Nazi sympathizers in Toronto formed swastika clubs, using Nazi imagery and chants to scare Jews away from the city's public beaches. Jews weren't short on brawlers of their own, and clashes between the two culminated on the 16th of August during a youth softball game between St. Peter's Church and a mostly Jewish and Italian club called Harbord Playground at a baseball field known as Christie Pitts. The two teams didn't have any problem with each other, but kids from swastika clubs had started coming to the games in protest, and on the 16th, the pro-Nazi Pitt gang showed up in force, attempting to turn St. Peter's win into an anti-Semitic rally. Harbord Playground had also attracted defenders from the mostly Jewish Spadina Avenue gang, who turned out to be much more athletic and better at fighting. The outcome was a 10,000-man brawl lasting anywhere between 1 and 6 hours. Inspired in part by the Christie Pitts riot, a British veteran and former Klansman named William Whitaker formed the Canadian Nationalist Party, which drew from unemployed Ukrainian and German Manitobans. In June 1934, the CNP marched on Winnipeg's Old Market Square, site of a general strike 15 years earlier that government forces had violently put down. I don't know what Whitaker was expecting, but apparently it slipped his mind that Winnipeg was the most virulently socialist major city on the continent, and the 100 or so marchers were met by over 500 trade unionists. With almost no police presence and the tacit approval of the provincial government, counter-protesters freely beat, stabbed, and bludgeoned the CNP brownshirts, sending 20 to the hospital. In 1938, the CNP merged with Arcon's blue shirts to form the Canadian National Unity Party, but it was no matter. Whitaker shortly died of a stroke, the Second World War began, pro-Nazi organizations were swiftly banned, and Arcon was imprisoned. Canada declared war 9 days after the German invasion of Poland. Over the next 6 years, nearly 17,000 Jewish servicemen participated in the Canadian Armed Forces, doing their duty both as Canadians and Jews. Canada's first major action came in June 1940, as the Army helped to evacuate British, Free French, and other Allied forces during the fall of France. Over the next 3 years, Canadians saw action primarily in the air and at sea. You wouldn't have found many Jewish sailors due to entrenched anti-Semitism in the Navy, so Jews disproportionately served in the Air Force, which isn't a stereotype, but honestly should be. In 1942, Canadians formed the bulk of the ground forces in the Dieppe raid, widely regarded as one of the Allies' greatest blunders. Or was it? Canada then participated in the invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy before leading the assault at Juno Beach on D-Day, going on to partake in the liberations of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands before invading Germany itself. Back on the home front, Canadian Jews engaged in wartime industry, agriculture, and allied projects in medicine, materials science, and most famously the atomic bomb, with Winnipeg's Louis Slotin playing a crucial role in the development of nuclear chain reactions before becoming the second person to accidentally kill himself at the hands of the infamous Demon Corps. Even after the war's end, Mackenzie King's government was adamant about keeping Holocaust survivors out of Canada, with one unknown spokesman quipping, "None is too many." Despite their efforts, about 4,000 still found their way in. The government also admitted 1,000 children who'd been orphaned during the Holocaust and prioritized visas for several thousand more survivors with family in Canada. Over the next several decades, the immigration process liberalized and its discriminatory features were repealed, resulting in a steady stream of Jewish immigration that continues to this day. For a variety of reasons, the war created opportunities for Jews to take more prominent roles in Canadian society. Aside from a handful of politicians and businessmen, pre-war Canada had never produced Jewish celebrities like the US had, nor had there ever been a Jewish cabinet minister or provincial premier or senator or Supreme Court justice. Perhaps it was due to their part in the war, or the anti-Semitic nature of the Nazi enemy, or the fact that most of the country's top anti-Semites had been discredited as traitors, but a lot of doors opened up. In 1943, Fred Rose was elected to Parliament for a mostly Jewish riding in Montreal as part of the newly formed Labour Progressive Party, which you'll note isn't the CCF. That's because it was a front for the Canadian Communists, and Rose, a perennial fringe candidate, barely squeaked through a by-election due to vote splitting. After Germany's defeat, a general election was called, and Rose won a slightly more convincing plurality, only to be outed as a Soviet spy 3 months later, whereafter he was convicted of espionage, stripped of his British subject status, imprisoned for 6 years, and spent the rest of his life in Poland, where he died in 1983. Though Parliament expressed embarrassment over Rose's loss of citizenship and passed legislation to prevent it from happening again, his guilt was never much in question. But his case didn't spark an anti-Semitic backlash either, as demonstrated in 1955 when Toronto elected its first Jewish mayor and the federal government appointed its first Jewish senator. 6 years after that, David Lewis helped reorganize the CCF into the New Democratic Party, playing an important role in the passage of Medicare before succeeding Tommy Douglas as party leader. The NDP also produced Canada's first and to date only Jewish provincial premier. The war also produced a new generation of Canadian Jewish entertainers, most of whom rose to prominence afterward through the new medium of television. One of the first, and maybe the most important, was actor Lorne Greene. After serving in the war with CBC News and then the Air Force, Greene broke through as an actor in radio before moving to the US and becoming the star of the popular Western series Bonanza. Greene might seem to break my rules, but his success set a trend of Canadian personalities in American entertainment, especially television, that continues to this day. And if I'm going to recognize any one of them in this video, it has to be him. He also moved back and narrated nature and environmental documentaries for the CBC. Plus, he was named Lorne, the most Canadian name. Compare that with the hometown heroes. Johnny Wayne and Frank Schuster grew up together in Toronto, did a lot of shtick together in the Boy Scouts, and when the Second World War began, they enlisted in the Army together and were immediately assigned to MC a touring radio show for the troops. Not USO, this was an actual part of the Army. Canadians are serious about comedy. Needless to say, they were enormously popular by the end of the war and hit the ground running, doing radio and television on both sides of the border. By the early 60s, they were the most popular comedy duo on the continent, but for one reason or another, they never settled in the US permanently. And though their stars faded in my country, they were a staple of Canadian TV until Wayne's death in 1990. In 1968, another Lorne Michaels, moved from Toronto to work on the American sketch show Laugh-In before creating Saturday Night Live, inspiring a competing program in Canada's own Second City Television, introducing the world to Eugene Levy and Rick Moranis. On a more musical note, the same era introduced the world to Geddy Lee, frontman for the Toronto libertarian prog rock band Rush. But if you were to ask an educated Canadian to name any two Canadian Jews, they'd probably name two people who were both born in Montreal in the 1930s. Coming from a working class but very literary family downtown, Mordecai Richler moved to France and then Britain as a young man, but became a darling of Canadian literary circles with his 1959 novel The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, which satirized the Canadian dream and Montreal Jewish identity through the perspective of its low-life protagonist. Duddy Kravitz remained Richler's most famous book and became a Hollywood movie in 1973. Richler, who moved back to Canada around that time, wrote many more popular novels as well as nonfiction, often touching on Canadian politics and culture. The grandson of textile magnate Lyon Cohen, Leonard Cohen grew up in a family of privileged uptown English speakers. Though I don't want to make him and Richler out to be more different than they were. Cohen did a fair amount of slumming downtown. The two men met several times and once almost got into a fistfight. But Cohen was always more of a classicist. As a young man, he published 2 novels and a fair amount of poetry that was well received, but in the mid-1960s he pivoted hard into music, after which he became a mainstream icon. Back in Ottawa, 3 more Jewish firsts arrived courtesy of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. In 1970, Trudeau appointed Bora Laskin as Canada's first Jewish Supreme Court justice. Laskin is mostly remembered as the sole dissenter in the infamous case of Murdoch v. Murdoch, a major setback for women's rights in Canada that provoked sweeping reforms and one of several incidents highlighting the need for a formal constitution. And in 1976, Trudeau appointed Barney Danson as Canada's first Jewish cabinet minister. The post-war period also saw the end of Montreal's status as the center of Canadian Jewish culture. In 1959, the death of Conservative Premier Maurice Duplessis triggered a massive realignment in Quebec politics known as the Quiet Revolution, transforming the once conservative, politically Catholic province into a vanguard of secularism and social democracy. You might expect this to bring about a golden age for Montreal Jewry, but it turned out to be a major setback, as secularization created an opening for a new, more lefty form of Quebec separatism. Over the course of the 1960s, a Marxist group called the Quebec Liberation Front engaged in a series of terrorist bombings, culminating in October 1970 with the kidnapping of a British diplomat and the provincial deputy premier, the latter of whom was killed. Prime Minister Trudeau responded by going scorched earth, declaring a state of civil war and hunting down the entire FLQ. Trudeau's response was criticized as overkill and helped legitimize the more mainstream Parti Québécois under René Lévesque, who unexpectedly swept into power in 1976 and passed a new law establishing French as the primary language of the province. In 1980, Quebec held a referendum on independence from Canada, and though it was defeated, the margin was narrower than Ottawa would have preferred. So in the hopes of keeping the country united, Trudeau's government passed the Constitution Act 1982. The new constitution removed the British Parliament from Canada's constitutional process, thus securing full independence. But it also created a loophole allowing federal and provincial governments to suspend certain rights, which the Quebec government has repeatedly used to entrench French linguistic supremacy and an escalating policy of laïcité, removing religion from public life. These policies were initially understandable given the power of the Catholic Church as well as the economic divisions between French and English speakers, but by the late 80s, the power dynamic had shifted, and policies originally intended to give Francophones an economic leg up, revitalize their language, and keep the priests out of politics increasingly targeted immigrants, religious minorities, and English speakers. For a lot of Montrealers, the endless escalation brought back uncomfortable memories of the 1930s and prompted public intellectuals to begin re-examining the nationalism of that era. For the most part, this criticism came from French-speaking Federalists, but one of the most visible critiques came from Mordecai Richler, whose 1992 satire O Canada, O Quebec suggested that the zealousness of French language policy was ultimately driven by the same illiberal ethno-nationalism as in the 1930s. The response was widespread, ferocious, and did nothing to refute his argument. In an opinion piece rife with dubious Nazi comparisons, columnist Daniel Latouche drew parallels between O Canada, O Quebec and Mein Kampf, while his editor, tellingly, wrote a preemptive defense against accusations of anti-Semitism by quoting an old column by Richler that had criticized Father Gru but had been mistranslated into French and reframed as a racist attack on the attractiveness of French-Canadian women. One separatist MP in Ottawa called for the book to be banned as hate speech, while another held Canadian Jews collectively responsible for condemning Richler lest they be accused of taking his side. As I said, Richler wasn't the only person accused of bigotry for daring to highlight documented instances of bigotry in the separatist movement. So this extreme defensiveness undermined efforts by separatist leaders to distance themselves from the appearance of ethnic chauvinism as they prepared for a second independence referendum in 1995. As the vote neared, historian Nadia Khoury, a French-speaking non-Jew, came to Richler's defense with an analysis of the responses indicating that, yeah, there was a lot of anti-Semitism there, belying a wider problem of latent racism and sectarianism in the movement. That suspicion was reinforced on election night, when Premier Jacques Parizeau blamed the referendum's narrow defeat on money and ethnic votes, only deepening a divide between the prosperous, diverse, federalist Ile-Montréal and the rest of the province, which persists to this day. Parizeau predicted that another referendum wasn't far off and would result in a separatist victory, but that never happened. Quebecers have largely accepted 1995 as the final word on the issue, and in the decades since, support for independence has only declined. Whatever the political calculus, the economic consequences are clear. Many of Montreal's largest businesses left in the 1980s, and though it would be wrong to say that it declined as a result of nationalist policies, it certainly fell behind Toronto, which supplanted it as Canada's largest city in 1997. The decline in economic clout accompanied a large migration of Anglo-Quebecers to Ontario, including a large segment of Montreal's Jews. So in the end, nobody really got what they wanted. But that isn't the end of the story. In 2025, Canada is home to the 5th largest Jewish population in the world. The exact number varies depending on the questioner's definition of Jewish, but if one tries to apply the definition under Jewish law, it's somewhere around 400,000, with a narrow majority living in Ontario. Visiting the community in Montreal, I was surprised by the proportion of young people, as well as the diversity of social classes. In spite of any concerns or reservations the community may have about itself, I was charmed and impressed by what I found, among Canada's Jews and with the country as a whole. Bigotry and violence are far from unknown, but the state of the communities that I saw are strong. Quebec's Jewish population actually began rebounding in the 2000s. There's even a small Francophone population. In 1962, Algeria won independence from France and, for a series of very complicated and very stupid historical reasons, immediately expelled its Jewish population. Most of the refugees moved to France, where they already held citizenship, but a large enough number arrived in Montreal to necessitate their own French-speaking school. At the same time, Yiddish has massively declined in Canada and is almost exclusively spoken by Hasidim, who mostly live on Ile-Montréal. The population is much more suburban than in the US, with several Toronto and Montreal suburbs appearing among the largest populations by city. For those curious about elected office, there are currently 9 Jewish MPs and 1 with a Jewish father. If time and budget had been no object, I would have gone across the whole country, but for the moment, Montreal and Toronto had to suffice. Thank you to everyone who helped me on this trip. It's been an exceptionally tough year on so many levels, and though I visited in January, the experiences I had in Canada have helped sustain me since. And, once again, this was a business expense. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, David Ben Yosef, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Milk and Honey, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.